Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to tonight's relevant conversation on poverty and prosperity. We're going to cover quite a bit tonight from the Unitarian perspective of divine abundance and imagined lack and what it means to be prosperous from a perspective of spiritual well-being. And we're also going to touch on how economic policies and laws also influence, from like a macro perspective, how those influence poverty and prosperity in other nations, which I promise is not going to be as dry as it sounds. It's going to be really awesome and really interesting. But first, we have our guest speaker, Dr. Ruby Payne from the AHA process, where she addresses poverty through a social cognitive approach. Dr. Payne, thank you for being here. If you would be so kind as to share your screen and make yourself the here, I'll make you the spotlight video. And real quick, Dr. Payne has a lot of experience empowering educators and community leaders to address issues of poverty in classrooms, communities, businesses, hospitals, churches, and social services. So basically everywhere. Her book, Emotional Poverty, won an IPPY award from the Independent Publishers Organization, which named it one of the best educational resources of the year. Dr. Payne, take it away.
All righty. Thank you so much. First of all, let me just say that I'm delighted to have a little bit of time with you and talk a little bit about some issues around class and why they have such a stubborn issue and have stayed with us for so long. One of the things is that almost all religions in the world look to see how they can, quote unquote, help their neighbor. And part of the issue is as you begin looking at how environments shape realities for people, one of the things we look at is a little bit of academic work here on what causes class. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it's one of the reasons we've never actually solved the problem is because there's no agreement on causation. Ryan mentioned he really likes science, and in the field of science, all disciplines move through three stages. They move from classification to correlation to causation. So classification, you name things like we noticed the stars and we named them, we called that astrology. And then Galileo came along and said they actually move in relationship to each other. That became correlation, that became astronomy. And then Newton came along and said there's a reason for it, gravity. That became causation. Well, actually, in the field of sociology, there's 4 well-researched bases about what causes class, and they've actually been politicized. And so I say this as we start to frame the discussion as we move through this. But first research base is that class is caused by the behaviors of the individual. So you'll hear people say things like, well, if he just didn't have that arm sleeve tattoo, he could have spent that money on something else, etc. The second research base is human and social capital in the community. That would be things like housing, transportation, jobs. It's things about the institutions and their ability to meet the needs of people in their community, the resources of the community. Exploitation is racism, sexism, predators. Political and economic structures are things that are structured in like redlining districts, like in the cliff effect, where you make a certain amount more money and you drop off the cliff. Well, what has happened is these have been politicized. And basically, if you are on the political right, you think it's the first 2 research bases, behaviors and social and political capital. If you're on the left, you think it's the last 2 research bases, which is exploitation, racism, sexism, political and economic structures. And then what we find is people start arguing about them. Causation. And then we do a lot of community work. I've done a lot of work globally, but what you will find is that you will find churches, institutions, political establishments, they start fighting about causation. What causes it? Should we give or not? Why didn't they do that with the money we gave them? Why happened here? And so they never ever come to a solution, a working solution. So what we define in our work is poverty is a set of resources and wealth. Poverty is the extent to which you do without resources. Wealth is the extent to which you have them. And we look at 9 resources. And one of the things that I will say is this, of these resources, the resource that creates the most personal bankruptcies is not having it. Surprises everybody, but it is actually physical resources. Does your body work? Medical illnesses are one of the biggest causes of personal bankruptcies, and nowhere has this been as clear as it has been with COVID, what a medical illness will do to your other resources. And on top of that, then, the two resources that we know that are most related to addiction, not having them, are spiritual resources and emotional resources. And in the hard research, the one resource that, if you have it, makes the biggest difference in your life is a relationship. Do you have somebody who cares about you and you care about them? It is the key resource for long-term success. Well, what we know is this. We, in our work at Bridges, we don't approach this issue so much from a social justice perspective as we do from a social cognitive perspective. We look at how people learn how to think. My background is as an educator, and one of the things we know is that your emotional self is pretty much heavily structured by the time you're 3, before you ever had vocabulary. So a lot of what people do and act on is what they've learned in their environment. And one of the things that happens when you're an infant, I think it's fascinating that your brain makes 700,000 connections a minute when you're an infant. You are making so many connections, and you're making them in relationship to your environment. So the demands of the environment, who and what you know, and your resources end up impacting your thinking. And one of the things we know is this, that then is how you begin to negotiate your environment. And when resources are thin, people tend to live on the left side of this chart. When people have lots of resources, they live on the right side of this chart. And we're going to define middle class as when your resource base is stable. In other words, you know where you're going to sleep at night. You know you got food every day. It's stable. And one of the things I'll often ask an audience is this, and I'll pull down the chat box, but one of the questions I'll ask them is this, and I'll ask that to you. In the chat box, why is it true if your resources are really thin, why is it true that it's almost impossible to plan? If you don't mind writing to me in the chat box, why does it become almost impossible to plan when your resources are thin? Yes. Yeah, that's right. Your resources go to surviving. And another thing is they're not predictable. But they become very quickly depleted. You spend a lot of time hunting for resources, and life becomes very unpredictable. But if you want to do well in school and work, you have to be able to plan. So what you have are things that are diametrically opposed. And when Ryan and I were talking about this, one of the things I didn't talk very much about was the fact that one of the patterns that happens when your resources get thin is that your thinking becomes polarized. In other words, if I go to the grocery store with $2, I can buy this or I can buy this, but I literally can't have them both. And so one of the things, as we move through this, then, you will see that your time becomes one of your most valuable limitations and one of your most valuable assets. And how you spend your time determines what you know. Around the world, and I've worked in India and China and Europe and Malaysia, around the world, one of the ways we're all really alike is we all have 24 hours a day. And we take that 24 hours and we put it on an axis with our resources, and we manipulate them to figure out how to stay stable. Well, we have a program in our work. We've taken 80,000 adults in poverty through a program called Getting Ahead in the Getting By World. And what we do is we teach them how to stabilize their resources and grow their resources. And we say to them, you're a problem solver, you have to be, and you are an expert in poverty. You know more about it than anybody else. So tell us how you spend your time. And here in front of you on the screen is a compilation of what 300 adults in poverty tell us they spend their time on. If agency time is time you go to agencies for help, like food stamps, TANF, etc. So if you don't mind, in the chat box, what do you see on this chart that you yourself would not spend time on? Okay, agency time. All right. What else would you yourself not spend time on? Criminal justice. Okay. Finding money for criminal justice. All right. Okay. This next chart that you'll see is what people in stable environments. Now, basically, people move from generational poverty, 2 generations or more, to situational or working poor, to middle class where resource base is stable, to new money, which is about income, to old money, which is about connections. So when your world is stable, and we don't define it as money because people in the US from 25 grand to $250,000 think they're middle class. So this is what people in stable environments say they spend their money on and time on. Sorry, not their money, their time. Take a minute and look at this, and in the chat box, what do you see in this chart that you did not see in the first chart? Vacation, yes. What else do you see? Clubs and civic groups, education, social media, yeah. All right. Mortgages, retirement, asset development. This last chart is what people in wealth say they spend their time on. Now, this will be the top 1% of households, 10.4 million or more. What do you see on this chart you didn't see on the other charts? Sabina says almost everything. All right. The bottom line is that it's a different reality. I not too long ago had a congressman say to me, there's no difference between relationships and connections. I said, there's a huge difference between relationships and connections. Relationships help you get by. Connections help you get ahead. And the bottom line is you have all 3 of these circles in Houston. We have all 3 of them in Texas. We have all 3 of them in the United States and in the world. And basically, the circles don't talk to each other. They don't know each other. They don't talk to each other. And one of the things when churches start working, the research on churches, and there's a gentleman who did a lot of research on churches and economics, and he found that churches, there's 9 layers of what he called economic frames. And he said that most churches cannot operate within, no matter where you are on the continuum, their congregation is in three of the levels, 3 of the closest levels, no matter where they are in the continuum. But a congregation has difficulty operating beyond 3 levels of economic standing. And one of the reasons is because the hidden rules, the understandings of how the world works are so different. So what we find is this. Let me ask you in the chat box, which circle makes the laws? In the chat box, which circle makes the laws? Yeah, most of the laws are made in wealth, okay, the wealthy, yeah. And mostly the institutions are run by people in middle class. And what we find is that as the many churches, many foundations serve individuals in poverty. Now, what you find is that most people have their foot in 2 circles, okay? Sometimes people have them in 3. In fact, one of the most interesting groups I work with are foundations, because foundations have on their boards people from old and new money. They basically are run by people from middle class, and they basically serve individuals in poverty. And so one of the things is you have these huge disconnects of understandings. Well, how you spend your time and your resources really impact how you negotiate your environment. And it shows up first in time and money. And what you will see, the driving force in this middle circle is that people spend their time on three things: work, achievement, and material security. What people in the middle circle do is they go to work, they go to school to get a better job, like Ryan's talking about going back to graduate school, okay? And they buy things that become an asset, like a mortgage. And they have 4 rules about money. And one of the rules is, Ryan and I went through this already, so he knows them, but let me go through them with you. I'll say the first part, and you can say the second part. The first part is 4 rules about money in this environment are: number 1, I don't ask you for money, and what? You don't ask me, okay? Number 2, if you borrow, you have to what? Pay it back. Number 3, you never quit a job until you have
Another job.
one. And number 4, do you tell people your salary? No. But if you were in wealth and you've been in wealth 2 generations or more, you have a different problem. Your problem this time is you have resources more than you can take care of yourself, and you have to have people to help you. And that makes you vulnerable at a personal safety level. So in wealth, you make your decisions against your financial, your social, and your political connections for 2 reasons. Number 1, it helps you make more money. And number 2, okay, it keeps you safe, which leads to another hidden rule. If you go to a hidden rule are unspoken cueing mechanisms people use to let you know you do or don't belong. Like, let me ask you this question in the chat box. How many of you have been in a social setting and it was so uncomfortable you could not wait to leave? How many of you had that happen? Well, what's going on is there's just lots of unspoken cueing mechanisms that you're not comfortable with, okay? And what happens is in wealth, one of the ways these hidden rules go up, if you go to a party among the truly wealthy, if you introduce yourself, they'll turn around and walk off. My former husband, before he died, he was in the Chicago Board of Trade, and he was a bond trader. And the rule is you are introduced. And when you're introduced, they say your name and your connection right away so that people know whether you're safe or not. They'll say, well, this is so-and-so with such a firm or family. But if you go to a party among the middle class and you don't introduce yourself, then you're rude. So here you have a situation where it's different ways to negotiate an environment. And what's the rule about money and wealth? The rule about money is this: you just don't talk about the cost of an item. You just don't, okay? See, in middle class, if somebody wants to know if you're worthy of respect, they ask you within 5 minutes of meeting you, what do you do? But in wealth, they want to know who you know. And so it's part of this whole mix. But if you went to poverty, then you have a different problem again. Your problem this time is that you don't have financial security. You have a few things, okay? And your problem is your resources are thin. My brother in Ohio, he made the slide from stability to instability in 10 years. Didn't take him 2 generations. He was farming. Farming was brutal. He lost his farm. And then he bounced around with employment for 2 to 3 years. During that time, he and his wife had a severely handicapped child. The child is 26 now and can't feed himself. Then he got sick. Then he couldn't work. Then he died. He got cancer. He died. So I paid for where he lived. I had a sibling who bought him gasoline. Another sibling gave him cash. I gave him cash. We all got together and bought him a vehicle. But he made his decisions against relationships, survival, and entertainment, not against work and achievement and material security. People kept him alive, not work. And one of the characteristics of generational poverty around the world is that men do not have work, or they only have intermittent work. When you don't have work, there's a brilliant African American sociologist out of Harvard. His name's Wilson. He said this: if you want to break a culture, all you have to do is take work away from men because it changes identity. And so the problem is this: you don't have work, so people are what keep you alive. And when people are your possession and your survival, then the rules change. See, that's why I fight over, that's why one of the things that happens is in generational poverty, not situational poverty, but in generational poverty, people, parents, adults often fear their children getting too educated. It's legendary in community colleges, the number of women who get 1 or 2 classes away from a degree and quit because the relationships, their partner relationships, they don't want them to be educated. And here's the reason why. It's a fear of loss. See, middle class worries when they're old they won't have financial security. But what you worry about when you're old in poverty is that you won't have physical safety. And you want your children there with you. And in poor white neighborhoods, they will say things like, you're getting above your raisins, you're too big for your britches if people get too educated. In African American neighborhoods, they call them Oreos. Hispanic neighborhoods, coconuts. Asian neighborhoods, bananas. Native American Indian neighborhoods, apples. Red on the outside, white on the inside. But the issue's the same. I'm afraid we're going to lose you. Situational poverty, well, encourage our children to be educated. We also find that if they come out of a religious household, even though they're in extreme poverty, there is a push to get the children educated. And what's the rule about money? Well, the rule about money is this: if you ask me for some and I have any, I have to share with you. Money is communal. One of the things is that it creates huge issues, because part of the issue for churches then are this: if you have a church that operates, whose membership is mostly here in this circle, and one of the things they work to bring in people in this circle, we find there's huge issues in churches, okay? Like one of the foundations I work with in Corpus Christi, they had been given, they work with diabetes. They had been given money for insulin to individuals from poverty. They were sharing the money and not buying insulin. So finally what the foundation did was they just bought the insulin. Because you see, people say to me, I don't understand why you have to share. It's pretty easy. If my car breaks down in middle class, I call AAA. But if my car breaks down in poverty, I'm going to call Uncle Ray. And if he asked me to borrow my food stamp cards and I said no, then when I ask for help, he's going to say no. So survival is very dependent upon the relationships. So I'm sorry I won't be able to join you for the rest of your discussion. But one of the things is, as you go on to discuss this online, I sent Ryan some books. You have them, and you can join our free conference. We're having a free virtual conference in September. So if you go to our website, ahaprocess.com, please join us. We'd love to have you. And Ryan, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. It was good having you. Thank you for being here. And we'll have that as an official Facebook event that we'll share on our Facebook page and all our channels and things like that. And at the end of my presentation, there's a slide about the free seminar coming up as well for those of you who are interested in it.
Thank you, Ryan.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ruby Payne talked about the social cognitive approach to prosperity and poverty. So what we're going to talk about next is the internal essence of prosperity, what Unity says about spiritual well-being as prosperity. And then we're going to talk about economic policy and legal policies from a much broader scale. So if you think of Dr. Payne's perspective as kind of a middle zoom in on culture and society, you can think of the Unitarian perspective as being individualistic, and the macro perspective I'm going to present after that as being as far back as you can zoom out. Okay. So according to unity belief, prosperity is spiritual well-being. We've been conditioned to believe we're shaped purely by external circumstances, but seeking prosperity challenges us to live from the inside out and be proactive. This is especially important because in countries like America and other places where the quality of living is pretty high, we are constantly bombarded by advertisements telling us either we're not good enough or we're great, but we're not as good as we could be yet. And so we have to buy perfume, cologne, the latest fashion, the latest smartphone, the latest car, the latest this, that, the other, and then we will be complete. And of course, as new models and new designs come out every single year, we're chasing a goalpost that is constantly moving. And if we chase that goalpost, then we're never going to feel whole. So instead, what we do is we start taking radical responsibility for our thoughts. And we realize that no one and nothing can ultimately decide how we think and feel. So if a cologne advertisement has made me feel not as attractive as I could be, well, instead of saying, well, how dare that cologne advertisement make me feel bad about myself, it's offended me or whatever, I can say, well, you know what, I don't have to feel like that if I don't want to feel like that. I can see that this advertisement has been specifically structured to create an urgent need in me, a hole to be filled with their product, and I can take a step back and realize that I already have everything I need, and I don't need anything else to make me whole. This can start by eliminating thoughts such as I can't, I'm afraid, and there is not enough from our consciousness. So for example, with I can't, I say that phrase probably more than I should. Of course I do, I'm human, and I can't is a common phrase. But one of the things I've noticed is when I really take a step back from saying I can't and look at what that means, what I'm usually saying is not I can't, but I haven't done this thing yet. And so there's this measure of insecurity there that comes with uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, instead of potential success, I put the idea of failure, of I've never done this before, therefore I don't know how to do it, therefore I'm going to fail. And so becoming aware of those thoughts and walking myself back from that cliff of I can't allows me to realize that the things I've built up in my mind to be these huge obstacles I can't possibly overcome are actually more like little mounds that, at the most will tire me a little bit, but I can overcome them. The same thing goes for I'm afraid. I take that sentence and I recontextualize it using things I've learned from mindfulness therapy and cognitive or mindfulness meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy. So instead of saying I'm afraid, which is I am afraid, putting the idea of fear wrapped up in your whole being, I am afraid. What I do is I say I am experiencing fear right now, which sounds a bit robotic, but the point is to disassociate yourself a bit from that negative emotion. To, as one Buddhist monk said, you've got this happy, beautiful picture of life. Don't let the storm clouds of depression or anxiety take over the whole thing and color it dark. Now, you don't want to say, well, it doesn't exist at all. But what you can do is say, I am feeling fear, or fear is one of the emotions I'm feeling right now. And you can take that dark storm cloud of uncertainty, of fear, of depression, of whatever, and put it up in the corner. So it's still there. You're acknowledging it's there, but you're not letting it discolor the whole picture of life. And there is not enough. I can't tell you how many times I've thought that I didn't have enough of something. I didn't have enough recommendations to get a job, and I get the job. I didn't have enough scholarship money to get through college without debt, and I did, and on and on and on. There is not enough doesn't mean to me that there is not enough. What it usually means is I am challenged to find a creative way to do things. There is not enough ostensibly, but I can create a way that there is enough. We can also nurture prosperity in ourselves by talking about the things we want to nurture and grow. Instead of the things that we don't have yet. We can keep our thoughts centered in ideas of abundance, self-sufficiency, and well-being. We tend to focus our attention on lack, on unfulfilled desires, on ways that we are not complete, instead of on ways that we are already whole. So for example, there's a lot of things that I would like to do right now that I simply cannot do because of the pandemic. I want to hang out with my friends. I want to go on dates again. I would like to give a TED talk at some point. That's one of my big life goals in the next 5 years. I want to publish a book. I want to move out on my own and live independently, kind of like I did during my college years. I love my family, but I miss those days. And if I focus on all those things that I don't have, I can feel, kind of depressed and like I haven't done much or I'm not good enough. I'm always chasing in the future. So what I've done instead is I say, okay, instead of focusing on those unfulfilled desires, what if I focus on all the ways that that I am complete? So for example, instead of saying, well, I haven't done a TED talk yet, and using that as a benchmark of when I'm good enough at public speaking, or I'll be good enough at public speaking, or I'll be proud of myself at public speaking when I give a TED talk, I say to myself, when I was a kid, I had a stutter and I couldn't say my R's, which with a name like Ryan Ruffaner, you can imagine would be a bit difficult. And so I've gone all this way to improving my stutter and giving 1 to 2 hour long talks in front of audiences, both online and in person. So, I've already achieved a lot in that domain. Instead of saying, well, I'm not complete because I'm not living on my own yet, financially independent, I can say, for the first time in many years, and even living on college campus, I have roommates that I really, really like, who really, really understand me and what I need. And on top of that, I don't have to pay rent. I do have to pay utilities, but I don't have to pay rent. According to Eric Butterworth, prosperity is a way of living and thinking, not just money or things. And poverty is a way of living and thinking, not just a lack of money or things. This is because our thoughts can create reality. Now, don't get me wrong, there is some grain of salt. You take this with a grain of salt, because if you're falling from an airplane with no parachute, you can't think your way out of gravity. But at the same time, I'm reminded of that one example that comes up all the time in psychology circles and in among Buddhist monks, where they'll talk about, if you have a harmless cord of rope in your backyard, let's say, and it's completely harmless, it's just a cord of rope, but somebody tells you that there are dangerous snakes on the loose and you've got to be careful because one bite will kill you. Then you go outside and you might see that coil of rope and immediately go into fight or flight mode and go, oh my God, that's a dangerous snake. You might run away, you might throw a rock at it, you might throw a rock and then run away, call animal control, and suddenly you're thinking about all the danger. And what if there's more deadly snakes in my backyard that I didn't see? What if while I'm inside calling animal control, the snake moves and I lose track of it? What if they're already in the house? Meanwhile, it's just a harmless cord of rope. So our thoughts, to a large extent, can create reality. And so, if we say, well, we're not complete, or I'm not as complete as I could be because I don't have the latest gizmos or gadgets, well, the train of invention just keeps on going and going. Things are going to keep innovating. People are going to keep inventing new things, and they're going to keep marketing them to us. So if we keep evaluating ourselves as prosperous or impoverished based on external circumstances, then those things are going to be completely up to other people, not us, which is why, in Unity, we challenge people to focus on abundance rather than lack. And even doing this in my personal life has helped me, because I realize that, if I've got enough money to spend on a burrito, as many times as I go buy burritos, or as many times as I used to, which was a lot, then I can't say anymore that I don't have enough money to donate to the charities that I care about. The simplest proof of abundance is to take a look around you. Granted, spiritual well-being is one of the best marks of abundance, because you can carry it with you no matter where you go. But one of the things I was struck by going for a walk during this pandemic and feeling frustrated, and woe is me, we've got a quarantine. I had the quarantine blues, and then I stopped for a moment, walked around my neighborhood, and I realized that where I live is incredibly prosperous compared to most of the world right now. And where I live and the things that I have are remarkable, incredible. And I'm extremely abundant, not just compared to people who live in the world nowadays, but people who live or have lived throughout all of human history. I mean, if you think about it, in the suburbs anyways, we live in these little brick castles complete with plumbing, clean drinking water, clean bathing water, which are separate from each other. We have refrigerated food and working stoves and ovens. We've got oftentimes separate bathrooms, air conditioning. I mean, do you think that maybe some civilizations in hotter climates would have dreamed about air conditioning one day? So I was looking around and I was like, I might be, I might have to quarantine right now, but I'm quarantining like a king. I am incredibly blessed and prosperous to have all of these things. Hold on, I'm going to check hearing an iPhone break. Oh, okay. Okay. Oops. Okay. Sorry, I had to mute one of the other. Okay. So at the same time that we know focusing on abundance and prosperity is really important in helping create a reality of comfort and gratitude and happiness, we also have to acknowledge that there are some countries which have a poorer standard of living than others, and some have a higher standard of living than others. Well, why is this? Dr. Payne illuminated this to some degree when she talked about the social cognitive model. And of course, I will share the screens, the PowerPoint slides with y'all after this presentation. But I want to talk about this also from a macro perspective. First, though, we have to get clear about what things don't contribute to poverty. And these are things that for a long time prevailed as the most important distinctions between what makes people poor and what makes people not poor. One of the biggest ones was geography. So researchers used to believe that the biggest difference between poverty and prosperity was geography, and those with warmer tropical climates made people lazier than those who live in more temperate climates. And I guess they didn't really do a lot of research on the Aztecs or the Mayans or the people around the equator who lived in very prosperous, powerful societies. But anyways, in the modern world, we were able to disprove this because of a little place called Nogales. Nogales is a town split in half across the US-Mexico border. Nogales, Arizona, to the north, has a much higher standard of living than Nogales, Sonora, with better access to healthcare and education. The crime rates to the north are lower, and the average household income is 3 times higher. Now notice here, when I talk about their prosperity, there is only one part of it that talks about actual money and income. The others, like Dr. Payne was talking about, are resources. The higher standard of living means that, you don't have to have bars on your window, let's say, or the wheels of your car might not be stolen. The people have better access to healthcare. If they have better access to healthcare, then if they get injured at work, they can get fixed up and go right back to work and continue providing for themselves and their family. There's better education and the crimes are lower. So there's more stability and resources overall. And again, this place, geographically the same. There's no difference. But there is another dividing line that really makes the biggest difference, and we'll get into that in a second. The second biggest misconception about poverty is the cultural hypothesis. So the famous German sociologist Max Weber claimed that Western Europe's higher rate of industrialization came from its so-called Protestant work ethic. And this shouldn't be that too surprising that people want to talk about culture as the defining factor in prosperity or poverty, because it gives people, or it seemed to give people, agency over their poverty and prosperity, and it also gives people kind of bragging rights, so if your culture is really successful, then you go, oh, well, it's because we're better. But is this actually true, and it turns out no, because we can look at cultures that are the same, but have been cut in half by other means. So take the two Koreas. North Korea and South Korea are the same geographically, same ecosystems and all that. And, from a historical perspective, they've split really, really recently. They've got the same cultures. They're collectivist as opposed to individualistic like the United States. They're very hierarchical as opposed to egalitarian, again, more like the United States. Or if you really want to be egalitarian, the best example would be Iceland and certain Scandinavian countries. The Koreans in general are heavily influenced by Confucian ethics and Confucian philosophy. And yet when we look at the two of them, they're so vastly different. They are incredibly different. The people to the north are starving, and the people to the south have so much food to eat that they can't eat it all. And I was an exchange student in South Korea for a couple months, and I know I couldn't eat it all, and there were definitely nights where I tried because it's so freaking good. You know, in the South, they've got easy access to education, easy access to jobs, public transportation. They've got great access to healthcare. I mean, I had to go there for something I got in my eye. I went to see I don't remember the exact name of them, but it's an eye surgeon. Picked up meds to help make the eye better. All of that, forgetting to use my insurance, cost me $30. And I was right back into the classroom, just like that. You know, this thing that could have made it really difficult for me to see the board and learn, interfering with my education, something that would have made it really hard for me to drive if I had my own car, just fixed like that because of their really affordable, easily accessible healthcare situation. And you compare this to North Korea, whose education pretty much focuses on propaganda, where Kim Jong-un is the perfect ruler, and the West is evil. And the differences couldn't be more stark. Another difference is another misconception is the ignorance hypothesis. This said that countries are impoverished because their leaders are ignorant of policies that might encourage economic growth. Now, the big thing I want to point out here is there's a difference between the so-called ignorance at the top of the power spectrum and the ignorance of the people on the bottom. We know from decades of research that improving the knowledge of the general public, through strong public education systems, let's say, is really important in making a country prosperous. But just because a leader is leading a country poorly does not mean they simply don't know how, right? That would be really nice, though, because they'd be like, oh, well, you don't know what you're doing, therefore we'll just tell you, and things will start going smoothly then on after. And we see that's not the case. A lot of the people who take power in impoverished countries are, if not intelligent, they're very, very clever. They're very, very wealthy. So it's not like they're suffering along with the rest of their people. And some of them are highly educated, So for example, Kim Jong-un, he went undercover to a Switzerland university for 4 years. He studied there. He learned about, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. He learned about economics and good government from the perspective of a Western education. So we can't claim that North Korea is impoverished because the guy with supreme power doesn't know better. Ignorance doesn't work as a viable hypothesis for poverty. So what actually makes the biggest difference then in poverty and prosperity in a nation? A society's political and economic institutions largely determine prosperity. So the first thing that we want is inclusivity, right? Inclusive economic institutions stimulate economic success by encouraging everyone to participate in economic activities and earn rewards proportional to what they put in, right? That's important. The more people you have involved in the economy, the more those people are going to vote for politicians and officials and policies that help them get ahead in the world, which means with everybody vying for their own stability, let's say, stability of resources, that the government has to then pay attention to everybody. Prosperous countries tend to have three things, including private property laws, well-developed banking sectors, and strong public education systems. Now, when I talk about private property laws, I'm talking about all kinds of private property. I'm talking about private property as in your home, and I'm also talking about private property as in the things you own and your ideas, intellectual property. So, for example, let's say you want to increase the value of your home so you can sell it years later and make a profit. but you know that no matter what you do to that home to increase its value, you could add a pool in, you could refurnish the cabinets, you could redo the countertops, do new carpet, new wood floors, etc., etc. If you knew no matter what you did to improve that, that ultimately the government owned your house and they could take it away or commandeer it at any time, would you really feel incentivized to do those things to increase the property value of your home? Well, probably not, because you can't reap the benefit of it. And the same thing goes for innovations and private property laws related to intellectual property. So if you're struggling, you're working 12 to 14-hour days, and afterwards you're so exhausted, you barely have the energy to make yourself a meal, to take care of the kids, and all that kind of stuff. If you barely have the time for those things, and you know that if you invent something new that could make you a millionaire, but the government is going to take it away from you and reap all the rewards, how likely are you to do that? Because it's not easy to innovate. You have to have an idea, you have to test it out, you have to make viable prototypes that reflect accurately whether or not the final product will work, you've got to market it, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot that goes into innovation. And so if you know, like in North Korea, that your innovation would be taken by the government, or if you know that a predatory type corporation would take your idea and there'd be no legal repercussions whatsoever, would you spend that time when you're tired after work drawing up those blueprints for your new idea? Probably not. Research shows that you're going to keep your head to the grindstone and just do what you need to do to get through the day. Focus on getting by instead of getting ahead, as Payne said. The second thing is well-developed banking sectors. Now, banks get a bit of a bad rap, and I'm not going to go into that, but I will say one of the things that banking sectors do is they encourage people to shift from short-term thinking to long-term thinking. And they do that by getting people to invest in long-term things like retirement. So if all the money you earn right now, you had to hide and store physically, how much money would you feel comfortable storing physically? Like if you could only put it in your mattress or dig a hole in the backyard or something like that and hide your money in it, how much money would you feel comfortable allowing to build up in that spot before you thought to yourself, oh my God, this is too risky. Now I just have to get rid of this money, or else, somebody might see me digging in my yard and then dig it up later and take it. Or if my house burns down, the money in the mattress might get burned up with it, and there goes my life savings. If you don't have a way to save that money safely and securely, then research shows you're more likely to spend it in the short term. So well-developed banking sectors are really important in getting people to save for their future and think about their future. And the last one, and perhaps the most important, is a strong public education system. You want to make sure the general population is educated. To give you an example, I was reading this one book by a primatologist of his time he spent in Africa, and besides doing his regular research on like baboons and things like that, he also spent a lot of time with the local population. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how many of the things that we take for granted, we just naturally understand, these local people, they thought were magic. So dry ice, for example. The primatologist took out dry ice from a container and they thought it was magic because they saw it smoking and they assumed, okay, smoke, hot. Naturally, that's what you'd assume unless you've been introduced to dry ice before. And he's like, okay, we'll touch it. And they touch it and it's cold and they freak out. They're like, how is this possible? How is it smoking, but it's cold? The same thing happened to this poor dude who got trapped in an elevator. In the same memoir, the guy went in the elevator and the doors closed, and he saw the layout of the building before the door was closed. When they opened again, he saw a completely different layout. So instead of thinking like all of us do, well, it took me to another floor of the building, he thought that by some magic, he had been transported to a completely different type of building. So he was freaking out and like hyperventilating in the elevator for hours. And my point is that none of us have had chapters in our education system teaching us about elevators or dry ice or very basic things like that. But because we have a strong enough public education system that everybody around us has gleaned knowledge like that, those things have just come up in everyday interactions. There wasn't a whole chapter on dry ice, but because my mom has been educated in the public education system and after that higher education systems, she could tell me easily, well, no, that's not magic and it's not smoke, it's dry ice, So public education systems are really important in having an informed population, which is extremely critical to having a prosperous country. Now you compare this to extractive economies, which are the exact opposite. Extractive institutions take money from the people who work and give it to others, usually elites. Now, when I say that, I am not talking about taxes, right? I'm not talking about taxes, that we use to keep our roads paved and safe. I'm not talking about the taxes that we use to help people retire with Social Security or anything like that. I'm specifically talking about extremely extractive institutions, like when the Spanish conquistadors came to Latin America and they enslaved the native populations to fill their ships with silver and gold, and they didn't allow them to keep virtually any for themselves. I'm talking about the Kim family in North Korea, how they abolished private property and confiscated it on behalf of the government. Very extractive institutions. And the basic thought behind that, by the way, is when you extract too much from people and they realize they either can't keep any for themselves or they don't have enough, then usually they will either not work hard or they will do the bare minimum to not incur any punishment and then stop. And of course, to stimulate the economy, you need people who are proactive go-getters and innovators. So that's, it doesn't work. Then there's two dimensions of politically prosperous nations. Now, mind you, when I talk about politics, I'm not getting into the reason why people call politics a dirty word. I'm not going to get into any of that. What I'm talking about when I say politics is simply the way that people arrange themselves into groups. Anytime a bunch of human beings get together, we start coming up with rules of things you can do, things you can't do, how we're going to make decisions, what's wrong, what's right, who's in charge, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it turns out from the macro scale, there are things that help countries and communities become more prosperous. And one of those dimensions is when a society is politically inclusive, so that the power is shared between them. This allows everybody to have a voice in the direction the nation goes, as opposed to a select few making decisions for a vast majority. If you've got all these people living here, then you want all those people weighing in on what's going on in the nation, because if they don't, then you have, people who are making decisions for other people whose lifestyles they can't even comprehend. So, like Dr. Payne was saying earlier, she mentioned that the people in various circles have a hard time understanding how each other lives, and how the people who make a lot of the laws now are the wealthy people. And I remember reading this one book a long time ago that was talking about, at what point do you have so much wealth that relating to anyone else with less than you becomes nearly impossible? And so that's one of the things that in a prosperous nation you want to prevent. Not preventing wealth, not preventing people from profiting off of their hard work and their technological innovations and things like that. But you want to make sure that everybody is represented equally. So, poor people can say, hey, look, maybe some of y'all are living well, but we're not, and we'd like some changes there. One of the biggest differences you can see in the world is between Russia and the United States. So in the United States, granted, the voting system here isn't perfect, but we generally have a ton of people from every single state voting for elected officials in just about every single election. And we've had a whole smorgasbord of candidates. I mean, just a whole, almost like a family feud of candidates, some of these elections. And you compare that to Russia, where they have the same candidate for president over and over and over again. It's like Vladimir Putin or Vladimir Putin, and then some years they'll throw in another candidate, and then that candidate either, polling locations will close down before people can vote for him, or the guy will get assassinated, or something will happen, so that basically you have a very few people making decisions for a vast majority of people, which excludes people from the political process and hurts the nation economically. The second dimension of politically prosperous nations are a centralized government. Now notice I didn't say a small government or a big government. I said centralized government, which means that true power comes from upholding the rule of law. When the law works for everyone, there's no need for people to split into different factions and fight each other for supremacy. So for example, an anti-example of this would be cartels. I was watching a documentary recently about cartel violence in Latin America. They went all over to a bunch of different places. And one of the things that came up again and again and again between police officers and government officials and journalists and even just ordinary people on the street was, we want this to end. We don't want to live like this anymore. We want the cartel violence to stop. But the government doesn't have enough power. The cartels have more guns. They've got more people. They've got more power. They don't rule by law. And in those places, the rule of law doesn't mean nearly as much as the rule of power, so to speak. Can you outbribe your opponent? Okay, well then you've won. Can you outkill or intimidate your opponent? Well then you've won. And what that leads to is a whole lot of chaos, which is the exact opposite of stability and order, which is what, as Ruby Payne was saying, that's what everybody is striving towards. And one of the things that was also brought up in this documentary was that the cartels will often fight to keep certain communities in poverty, because when these people have no economic prospects at all, they turn towards the cartel, to help them out. They say, hey, can you help me? And the cartel says, well, cool, we've got a spot open for you. Versus if the people had their own jobs, they wouldn't need the cartel. They wouldn't need to join the cartel to get through the day. But because there is that chaos that prevents them from getting a sustainable job, they either face starvation or joining a gang. And the cycle of chaos begins to just feed itself. Fortunately, there is such a thing as self-reinforcing prosperity. This is when inclusive institutions stimulate economic growth and reinforce themselves over time. So you can think of this, a good example is America's long journey to universal suffrage. So originally it was wealthy land-owning white men who could vote. So even white men without property couldn't vote yet. Just a select few making decisions for everybody. And I mean, go figure, they made a lot of decisions about the economy that only benefited them because, of course, they're the only ones who had the power. And then eventually, white men without property said, hey, well, wait a minute, we want to vote too. I mean, we may not be wealthy, but we're white. I mean, come on, So, and then they got the ability to vote. And then, when black men and slaves were freed, and then black men got the right to vote. And then on and on it went. Women got suffrage, and more people got the right to vote, because it's just something with human beings. Like when you see somebody else getting some kind of reward or something that you want, then you go, well, hold on, they're getting that. I want that too. And that's how this can become a self-reinforcing cycle of prosperity. Some group gets included. And another group says, hey, well, they got included. I want to be included too. And then other group sees that happen, they say, okay, we want in on this as well. And so slowly more and more people become involved. And of course, because everybody's striving to be economically stable, their voting decisions typically reflect that. Another great way to encourage a prosperous cycle from a macro perspective is to encourage and stimulate media coverage. Now, believe me, I know that the media can be a bit biased nowadays, and there's even some websites that flat out publish fake news. But overall, media coverage, although biased, is usually pretty accurate. And this is important. It's important to pay attention to media coverage, even if we have to take a break from it every now and again because it gets stressful. Because increased media coverage of powerful figures keeps voters informed of those people's political intentions, and this allows citizens to make informed demands of their government. There's that expression, don't bring me a problem if you don't have a solution. Well, as a ordinary citizen, you can complain about what's going on in your life, about what's going on in your community, but if you don't have an informed direction to go in and say, this is what we want, then you're not going to move the needle much towards progress. To give you a good example of this, in the early 19th century, you had these giant US companies who were creating monopolies. And at the time, people really didn't care. And they didn't care not because it didn't impact their lives at all. They didn't care because their emotional bandwidth was spent focusing on other things. They were thinking about everything they had to do to get through the day. And then United States media companies began focusing on these monopolies. And they began informing people about what was going on, about potential abuses in power, and what citizens and how it might affect citizens in their everyday lives. And then the citizens, now informed about what was going on, began pressing for reform. And as a result, Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson enacted anti-monopoly laws to break up these giant companies. And again, we're seeing the same thing today, although it does concern me a little bit that we're not seeing it covered as much. But there was recently a congressional hearing with Google, Facebook, and Amazon about the exact same thing, about are they becoming monopolies? Are they stifling the economy? Are they unlawfully taking out their competition instead of allowing them to compete in a free market? Again, this goes back to that whole ignorance hypothesis and almost the dual nature of it, where ignorance of the leader is almost never a factor, but having an uninformed general public is a recipe for disaster. So good media coverage of things that are going on at the top of the power structure, whoever's making the decision, can help encourage people to make reform in the right direction. You can't reform what you don't know about. Now, some leaders, though, choose poverty, right? These are the ones who aren't ignorant of it, which I think are most of them. And we have to remember that in impoverished countries, these guys are almost always very wealthy. I'm thinking about certain African countries whose people are starving, and their leader is like, he's just got so much gold jewelry. He's got designer shades, designer suits. He's got several super expensive sports cars, private jets, private helicopters. He's fine. He's very wealthy, but his people are not. And then Kim Jong-un, his people are starving. Obviously, he's not. So why is this? Well, mostly it's because people at the top, when you win everything, let's say, you're not really incentivized to share. And this is because, especially in with extractive institutions, whether political or economic, it's a winner takes all, not winner takes a lot, not winner takes most. It's winner takes all. So, for example, if you become president of the United States just tomorrow, you're still not going to win it all, because you're not going to be as wealthy as Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett, and you might not even be the most powerful person politically, because in our political system, the power is dispersed so that there are checks and balances on people. You can't do anything. But in countries with extractive economic and political institutions, where the dude at the top the dude at the top has complete power, as soon as you get up there, you can do anything. You don't have to share your power. You don't win many things. You win everything. It's a bit like if you've got 1,000 people competing for a goodie bag at a raffle, but it's like a really, really good goodie bag. Like, it's got the best kinds of chocolate, which for me are like cocoa dusted truffles and Godiva. It's got some good bread. It's got good wine. It can be whatever you want. But imagine that you're all competing for that one winner takes all prize, and then somebody wins it. How likely is that person? How likely is it that that person is going to share all the resources they just got with everybody else now that they've won it all? Not very likely. But it's not just a single person at the top that stands to benefit from these extractive economic institutions. It's also anybody who's profited from it economically, which leads to something called creative destruction, which sounds like a bit like an oxymoron. But basically, it's when innovations improve efficiency, but they also obliterate old economic sectors. So, for example, in the traditional textile industry, every time that a new innovation came out that made sewing faster, a loom, a sewing machine, et cetera, every time one of those things came out, the process of making textiles became that much better. But more and more people were fired. More and more people lost their jobs because they weren't needed anymore. And this happens all the time. I mean, how many cell phones do you see people have as opposed to smartphones? How many fax machines do people use now compared to scanners? How often do you pay for something using coins or cash as opposed to a credit card? Every time there's a new innovation, new economic sectors feel a bit of a strain. And what usually happens is at the top of those old economic sectors are people who, let's have a little, compassion here. They work their way up to those positions of power and influence and prosperity and stability and resources, and they don't want to lose it all. So I think for me, one of the most striking, relevant examples right now is the natural gas industry in general. We know the science is telling us that we need to pivot immediately to renewable resources and renewable energy. We know that we can do it. We know that we can take a lot of the cars and therefore the pollution and greenhouse gases off the earth just by instituting high-speed rail and things like that. The part of the problem is that there are people who are very wealthy, who work in the oil and gas industry, whose economic livelihood is now threatened by this new economic sector of renewable energy. So instead of saying, well, okay, we'll let them compete in the free market, they say, you know what, I would rather pay politicians to vote against renewable energy methods and therefore consolidate my power instead of allowing things to change. We talked about self-reinforcing prosperity. We also have to talk about self-reinforcing poverty. This is when extractive institutions create a vicious cycle that continues to prolong and perpetuate them. So I mentioned an example with the oil and gas people at the top. Another example is Jim Crow. So when American slaves were freed, they were ostensibly free. They seemed to be free. But a lot of the people who used to own those slaves didn't want the slaves to be free. They saw, they saw it as a lot of things, but one of the main things they saw it as was them losing their economic foundation. And they're like, okay, well, they might be legally free, technically free, but let's see if we can influence the political process to make sure they don't get any power. So these extractive institutions did their best to make politics as exclusive as possible. Okay, so legally you're free, legally you're considered a citizen, but we're going to put a poll tax on your ability to vote. So if you don't have any wealth because you can't get a job because you're black, or you don't have any generational wealth because you were just a slave and you have no money, well then too bad, you can't vote for your own best interests or the other slaves like you in the upcoming election. Or they put a literacy test on there. So everybody who had a proper education growing up, they could take the test. But again, if you're a slave and you weren't allowed to be educated, which is the case with all slaves, then you weren't able to pass the test and you weren't able to vote. So this is one of the ways that extractive institutions can reinforce poverty over time by crowding people out of the political and economic process. This brings me to the iron law of oligarchy. Honestly, that bold sentence is perhaps one of my favorite takeaways from this research, which is, generally speaking, extractive institutions emerge when leaders resist development and attempt to consolidate powers instead. I swear to God, I want to put that on billboards around the country. It's incredible, and it taps into what we were talking about with both Jim Crow and the oil and gas industry. So, in the case of Jim Crow, development was freeing the slaves and giving them equal rights. But they didn't want to do that. So instead of giving power away to everybody and allowing everybody to vote, including black men, they said, well, instead, let's just make it difficult for blacks to vote. Let's resist that development and make our political institutions more exclusive. And another thing they did, come to think of it, was in the 13th Amendment, and this is true, in the 13th Amendment, slavery is not actually outlawed. There's a small exception in that, which is slavery is not allowed except for as punishment for a crime. So immediately after the slaves were freed and during Jim Crow, the some of the people in charge would routinely arrest black people because they couldn't get them to go back to work as slaves. That was illegal now. But they could imprison them and make them work that way for low or no wages. So this iron law of oligarchy is incredibly strong, but we have the power to stop it, thankfully. As consumers, we can make economic decisions, and as voters, we can make political decisions. We can choose how to influence what makes a nation prosperous, especially during critical junctures. I know Reverend Kira has talked about this a lot, and I think Reverend Curtis touched on it a bit too during our Sunday services. When we talk about how everything feels chaotic and uncertain right now, but at the same time, we shouldn't wish for things to go back to the way they were, because this is a moment of transformation and growth, and we need to see it through into a more prosperous future. So for example, the civil rights movement, that of course had a lot of turmoil, a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty, but something great came out of it. And right now we're seeing a lot of different forms of chaos. And yet I truly believe that if we tap into the best of ourselves and we use science and research and compassion, that we can encourage this prosperous cycle. I never thought within my lifetime that the people who work at grocery stores would be called essential employees. Now, granted, they still have to be paid like essential employees, but still, we are, I believe, on a path to making a difference and changing things. And this means not wishing to be anywhere else but where we are right now, and using this as an opportunity for growth. I think it is something that we can all do, especially the more educated that we are. So what does all this really mean? Because we've covered a whole bunch of different things. We've zoomed way out and looked at it from economic and political institutions. We've zoomed a bit farther in. We've talked about the social cognitive model, and then we've talked about our own personal agency to develop spiritual well-being within ourselves. So what are we to make of all this? Well, I think it's safe to say that our reality is a combination of all of these. And all of these things are simultaneously true. I don't want to leave you thinking that one is more true than the others, because from a macro scale, we know that nations prosper when they have inclusive political and economic institutions, and when the general population knows what those in power are doing so they can make informed voting decisions. The more people are included in a voting process, the more society will begin to reflect the wants and needs of everyone in that society. And the more inclusive economic institutions are, the more conducive they are to innovation and long-term savings with well-developed banking sectors and private property laws, the more people will invest in their future, will think about their future, and will begin saving monies in a way that makes the country or community more prosperous. We also know that nations tend to suffer and struggle more, becoming impoverished, when their economies are extractive, and they extract resources from the general population and concentrate it in the hands of a few powerful people, along with political power. The difference here is not a matter of geography, because as we've seen, there are cultures, there are countries that are divided geographically, or they're divided, but they're geographically the same, with radically different levels of poverty and prosperity. We've seen cultures with the exact same culture whose poverty and prosperity levels are also incredibly different. And we know that ignorance, when it comes to the leadership of a nation, isn't necessarily a factor, because those folks, most of the times, are very wealthy compared to the general population. And a lot of the times, they're also very educated. So we know that when our economy is looking to become more extractive, taking resources from the general population and concentrating it in the hands of a few, that is a warning sign that the country could be becoming more extractive. The same thing goes with political power. Now, of course, Dr. Payne touched on the social cognitive approach, which frames poverty and prosperity not just about money, but about resources and how people allocate those resources and their time to achieve stability. A lot of people aren't looking to get money to be the richest person in the world or buy a private dinner ticket with Beyonce. Most people are trying to get ahead in the world economically and politically, trying to make their voice heard because they want stability in their life. They want a future they can plan for and anticipate. They want conflicts or struggles or crises that pop up to be manageable. They don't want one medical bill to make them go bankrupt. And these resources and the time that people spend trying to allocate them, trying to acquire them, determines how they view the world and interact with other people, for better or worse. And this goes into what Dr. Payne was saying about how, the people in the separate circles don't necessarily talk to each other, which is a shame because they're all involved in the same system to a greater or lesser degree. And yet, it's hard to make society work for everybody if we don't know what a lot of the other people are doing or thinking or how they live their lives. Finally, our own spiritual well-being greatly contributes to prosperity. When we define ourselves by outer circumstances, by thoughts of lack or unfulfilled desires, we do tend to feel incomplete and unsatisfied. Now, I've brought up a lot of things that could leave us feeling kind of doom and gloom and like, oh, well, that was emotional, that was draining. But I think it's important to remember that regardless of the struggles going on in the world, regardless of the struggles and things going on in America right now, or maybe even in our own communities, we are surrounded by abundance. I mean, even right now, the internet connection I'm using to talk to you is something a majority of people in the world now, and certainly throughout history, haven't been able to have. The air conditioning I'm currently enjoying, thank God, in this Texas weather, is something I am grateful for. And I could go on and on about all the ways that I am blessed, that we are abundantly prosperous, and all the ways that we are emotionally and spiritually complete. Because the truth is, there are problems in the world. There is poverty and prosperity. And at the same time, there is also an inside-out way of looking at the world that focuses on wealth, prosperity, and abundance. And if we focus on that and everything else, then we can make meaningful change to the world to make the world more prosperous, and we can shift our own mindset to cultivate gratitude and fulfillment in ourselves. Thank you all for joining me for this relevant conversation on poverty and prosperity. If you would like to donate to our back to school drive, please contact Wendy at yubayouth@gmail.com. She'll get you sorted out. And the free seminar that Ruby Payne was talking about is addressing the challenges of poverty. It is September 21st through September 22nd. I will send y'all the slides from the PowerPoint, and I will put up this as an event on our Facebook page. These are my sources. I mostly took from the book Why Nations Fail, and I did some other research. All right, I'm going to unmute everybody. All right. Okay. There we go.
But that was great, Ryan. I really enjoyed that. It really made me think and analyze where we are as a society right now. And
you're well on your way to making a TED Talk.
Thank you. I got to shorten it by a lot, but yeah.
Oh, it needs some polish. You're really quite a long ways along the path there.
Yeah. Thank you. Do y'all have any questions?
It was very informative and a lot of information. Good job. I'm sure I'll think of questions, but not right now.
I mean, it's going to be on. I mean, obviously, I can answer to you. We live in the same house. But of course, this is also going to be on YouTube and on the Facebook page. And y'all, if y'all think of questions, you can ask them there, and I'd be happy to answer.
I was going to
Thank you
ask,
so much.
what are some ways that you can get or try to get the different circles to try and talk to each other?
Question.
Like I don't know if there's an exact answer to that, because obviously if the answer was simple, I'm sure everyone would have done it by now. But I'm just curious if you have anything off the top of your head that you're like, oh well, maybe we could try this or something.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I would say there's these videos. I don't remember who they're by. They're on YouTube, and it's usually two starkly different people who sit down in a room and talk to each other. So it'll be like, okay, this is the best example I can think of. Is like there's like somebody from the far right of the political spectrum, somebody from the far left. They sit down, they have a conversation, or like a Black Lives Matter person with a cop or something like that, or a nonviolence peace protester and a soldier or something like that. So yeah, I think one of the things that can be done is that face-to-face interaction. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I know basically the farther you get people physically away from each other, the more different they tend to think they are from each other, and the less they can actually talk about what matters. There's a lot of assumptions that people make about each other when there's distance, and even more that gets made when they belong to different groups. And another thing that I would say, that just off the top of my head, is to show the people within those different circles the value of everybody else. Because I was thinking about recently. Okay, so this is kind of different, but you'll see how it ties in. So one of my friends from college is working with the United Nations to help prevent violence against deaf people, which is in a lot of places in Southeast Asia and Africa is incredibly prominent. So there's this idea that if your child is born deaf, they're a demon or a curse, and that leads to a lot of people killing their deaf children. And what the UN is doing is, instead of saying like, don't do that, they say, well, hold on, let me show you how you can teach deaf people to be an economic asset, which sounds kind of cold when I put it like that. But basically, this isn't just a mouth to feed that you got to take care of. This is somebody who can, they can't hear you, but they can make jewelry and sell it. And therefore, they're not a burden, they're a boon, they're a blessing because of what they can do for you. So I think, getting those groups in a room together, I mean, hell, you might have to get them to put on like a plain white robe or something, because otherwise they're going to segment into groups as soon as they take a look at what each other are wearing. All the people in the designer clothing and go, oh, I don't want to associate with those people. But getting them in a room together and helping them to see the benefit of other people. So let's say the impoverished people don't just see the very wealthy people as the man oppressing them. And the wealthy people don't see the people who are very poor as the dregs of society that we have to put up with. So things like that is getting to know them as an individual, because as much as I would like human beings to be purely rational creatures sometimes, I have been shown that it's just simply not the case, and it never will be. So instead of being like, oh, well, technically, here's why you should like these people, I think it's best to humanize them by getting them to be human with each other. Kind of like socializing dogs that might want to bite each other,
I wanted to share something real quickly. Last night I was watching a video about a woman who joined the Hitler Youth way back when, and she's in her 90s, and she met a woman who is a Holocaust survivor, also in her 90s.
Yeah.
And the meeting between them was tense at first, but it was fascinating the way, like you say, when they humanized them, when they became respectful, when they realized, hey, you're a person, it changed the whole dynamic. And that same sort of thing where if you see somebody not necessarily financially of value, but you can see their humanity and just that we're all part of the same, we're all cast from the same mold. It was very enlightening.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you send me a link to that? I want to see that.
Sure.
Excuse me, if I could throw in a couple of ideas quickly.
Yeah, sure.
I believe that to answer the other gentleman's question, I would say pose it to all parties that it's in their best interest to do so. And to that, I would suggest that we teach history to our children and to our peers. If we look at the American Revolution, any of the Latin American revolutions from Spain, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Cuban Castro's Revolution, we will see that when the society becomes so polarized, where you have a majority in poverty and a very small number in power and of great wealth, with no middle class, that's when things tend to burst into open revolution, like Bastille Day.
Yeah.
So I would think that you could certainly say to the impoverished class, hey, why don't we help you get an education so that you can understand? And we could also talk to the very wealthy and say, hey, you need to kind of spread around the wealth a little bit or we're going to lose it all, okay?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an idea. It may not work, but that's what I can contribute.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. Learn from history, you know, and I think also one of the things, and this could, you know, I remember I was at a writers group talking this with this one girl, and she brought up a good point. She was saying, like, we've got to make sure that the people in positions of power, the people who have the power to influence other people, when they learn about history, but they're also compassionate. Because sometimes we'll get people who have learned about history, but their only lesson is how to do those evil things better. You know, and that was one of the points she brought up. I was like, dang, that's so true. You know, like 1984, George Orwell's 1984. I look at China nowadays and their surveillance state. I'm like, man, they read that book like a how-to guide instead of a warning. You know, so I think when it comes to learning about, you know, history, I think you're absolutely right. We need to teach people about history because there's so many times where we're acting like this is a completely new situation, so we don't know what to do because it's never happened before. But we do know what to do. We've seen it before. We know exactly what to do. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
I think a lot of the problem we have is trying to meet people where they are, and a lot of people don't. Just trying to find something, and I can't find it. Where we're working on some of those kind of things right now, trying to get people to wear masks and do the thing. We're trying to find a different way to get them to do it than just saying, when you say, do it for the community, do it for everybody. It doesn't resonate with a lot of people. And the same way I think saying, why don't you just give money, like billionaires, millionaires, why don't you just give money? And some of them do, but even the amounts they give often are smaller. So in that instance, you really need taxes to come in. You need the government to kind of come in and say, we're going to take a portion for the greater good. You know, historically, kings and all kinds of monarchs and rulers everywhere, if you let them, they will accrue lots of money and power until something stops them, like a revolution or taxes or regulation.
Yeah.
But yes, just trying to meet people where they are and find what speaks to them. So I work for an ad agency and we do a lot of our own research stuff. So one of the things we'd done for wearing a seatbelt, which is one of the campaigns I work on, was looking at trying to figure out like these people that are really obstinate. And there's not that many left, but there's still some of them. And they didn't want to do it for themselves. The message that worked the most was, well, if you go through the windshield and die, your family is going to be really sad. Your friends are going to be really sad. Don't wear it for yourself. Wear it for them. You don't want them to bury you. I mean, I'm being very blunt about it. We don't put it that way. But that's kind of the message is, you know, if you don't care about yourself, then what about people that do care about you? And trying to find that point that they say, oh, I should do the thing that benefits, you know, a lot of different things.
Yeah. I can say I've definitely been in a car with somebody who didn't want to put on their seatbelt, and that was extremely frustrating. I was like, what era do you think we're in? Wear your seatbelt. Like, come on, you've seen the click it or tickets. I mean, I don't know. Anyways.
That's and I mean I've had that before too, and then I end up whoever does it always gets a lecture on how projectiles, how your body becomes a projectile. It's not belted in, but
I don't start the car until I'm like, no, I'm not moving. It's getting hot, and then everybody else in the car starts pressuring. It's so hot, just wear your seatbelt. I'm like, yes, wear your seatbelt. That's right. Anyways, does anybody else have any more questions or comments? Okay.
I like
All right. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Oh. I really like to talk. I came a bit late, but thank you.
That's all good, man. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Very good.
Thank you, Ryan. You did a great job.
Enjoyed it.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you.